A quote from the book of Proverbs. Wisdom preacheth abroad, she uttereth her voice in the streets. At the head of multitudes she crieth out, in the entrance of the gates of the city she uttereth her words. Hello and welcome back to the Disputed Questions Podcast, Episode 3. My name is Harrison, and in this episode we'll be taking a look at the first part of the second chapter of Aristotle's Categories. But before we do so, a few quick prefatory remarks. It's been quite a while since the previous episode, and I apologize for the delay. A lot has happened since that episode came out, which was in mid-May, so just about 2 months ago, believe it or not. Since then, I've graduated from college, I moved back home from California to Tennessee, I spent a month in Colorado with my brother and sister-in-law, and now I'm back in Tennessee once again, at least for the time being. So there's been a lot of change and movement going on, but I'm excited to get another episode out and hopefully be a bit more consistent going forward about release frequency. As for the podcast itself, I've decided to make a few changes here as well. At the very beginning of the podcast, the idea was to spend about one episode per text that we cover, or perhaps a few more if necessary. But it pretty quickly became apparent that that just wasn't going to work out. There's just too much to say and discuss about these important texts. And so, going forward, I've decided to slow things down a bit. My plan now is to devote pretty much an entire season to one or two texts at a time. That way we have a lot more room to really dive deep into the text. I might also try in the future to make each episode a little shorter than I have been, maybe aiming at about 20 to 30 minutes each. That might make them easier to listen to all the way through, and it might also help me be able to get more episodes out more frequently. So I'd love to hear from all of you about what you think about these changes. If you have any comments or suggestions, please feel free to send them my way. I'll say more at the end of this episode about how you can do that. Now, with that out of the way, let's do a brief recap. In the previous episode, we read the first chapter of Aristotle's Categories, which introduced a distinction between homonymous or equivocal things, synonymous or univocal things, and paronymous or derivative or denominative things. Homonymy or equivocity refers to things which have a common name, but different definitions corresponding to that name, such as bat in baseball bat, or bat as in flying nocturnal mammal bat. Synonymy or univocity, on the other hand, refers to things which have a common name and the same definition corresponding to that name, such as when a man and an ox are both called by the name animal. Finally, paronymy refers to things which are called a certain name because of some feature that they have. And that name which they are called on account of that feature is derived from or named in relation to the name of that feature itself. One example of this is the words brave and bravery. The brave man is called brave because he has the feature bravery. And the words brave and bravery are related. They're identical except in their endings. Brave just ends with an E, while bravery ends in an ERY, obviously. So those terms are paronymous. So that was the first chapter. Now we can move right on to the second. This chapter presents two different sets of distinctions. The first is a division of things that are said into simple and composite. The second is a division of things that are into 4 classes. For this episode, we are only going to be focusing on the first division. The text is as follows. Quote, "Forms of speech are either simple or composite. Examples of the latter are such expressions as the man runs, the man wins. Of the former, man, ox, runs, wins." End quote. As a reminder, except for when I note otherwise, I'm reading mainly from the E.M. Edkill translation of the Categories, which is in the public domain and is available online for free at the Internet Classics Archive. I will also, however, be referring to the J.L. Ackrell translation. The Ackrell translation for the first part of the same passage above reads, quote, Of things that are said, some involve combination, while others are said without combination, end quote. The word that Edkill translates as forms of speech and Ackrell translates of things said is the Greek ton legomenon. Ackrell's translation here is more literal. The Latin translation of the Greek reads eorum quae dicuntur, which would also be of things which are spoken. But what does this mean? What are the things which are spoken? To me, the first thing that comes to mind is words. Words are what we speak. But it turns out that things are a bit more complicated, as Simplicius, a 6th century Neoplatonist philosopher, points out in his commentary on the categories. He writes, quote, "It is to be noted that what is said is, 1, the realities which is what discourse is about, and 2, the notions which are about the realities. This indeed is why, when we consider that someone is speaking without thinking, we say, 'You're saying nothing,' even if he does utter some kind of discourse or expression. According to a third meaning, what is said is the significant expression itself, as well as the discourse, for both expressions and discourses are said by someone. According to a fourth meaning, even meaningless expressions belong to the class of what is said, insofar as they are uttered at all." End quote. Let's break this down a bit. Suppose you have a friend who says something to you that you don't quite hear, so you ask, "What did you say?" The answer you're looking for in response to this question is not words. What you're looking for instead is the specific content of what he said, the specific content of the words. The reason this problem arises is because words, like ideas, are like signs. They are significant, i.e. they signify something other than themselves. The word bear is not an actual bear, but it signifies an actual bear. So the word can be considered in itself, qua word, qua specific sound, or it can be considered in relation to the formality or meaning or content to which it points. So the question arises, when Aristotle talks about things which are spoken, does he mean the words, which are the actual sounds that we make when we speak? Or does he mean the things which those sounds are about, the actual realities the words refer to? But Simplicius also adds two further possibilities besides just words or things. The first is notions or ideas or concepts. The reason why this is a possibility is because Aristotle, in his work De Interpretatione, makes the claim that words do not actually signify things directly or immediately, but only indirectly or immediately. He says that written marks are symbols of spoken sounds, and spoken sounds are symbols of affections of the soul, and then that what these affections are likenesses of are actual things. So for Aristotle, it seems that spoken words signify something in the mind, which in turn signifies real things. But if spoken words directly signify things in the mind, which for the sake of our discussion we'll just take to be ideas or thoughts, then it seems possible that what we speak could be taken to be the concepts to which our words refer. Finally, Simplicius considers that what is said could also refer to meaningless sounds, such as if I randomly blurt out some made-up word which has no intended meaning. Technically, this would still be a spoken sound, and so might possibly fall under the range of things which are spoken. So which of these four options does Aristotle actually mean? Simplicius quotes Alexander, I believe it's Alexander of Aphrodisias, who was one of the most influential of the ancient Aristotelian commentators, who wrote that, quote, "Here Aristotle is not saying that the things said are what is signified, but rather what signifies and is uttered," end quote. So Alexander takes it that Aristotle is referring specifically to words or expressions, and Simplicius agrees with him. He writes, quote, "How indeed could Aristotle be talking about realities here, when further on he says, of those things which are said with no combination, each signifies either substance or a quantified. For realities do not signify substance or the quantified, but they are substance or the quantified, whereas what signifies are expressions which are about realities." End quote. Here Simplicius refers to a passage from the 4th chapter of the Categories, where Aristotle first gives the list of the 10 categories and says that, of things said without any combination, each signifies one of the categories. Simplicius argues that since things themselves do not signify, but rather are signified by words, and if Aristotle says that things said without combination signify the categories, then it cannot be the case that the things said are the actual things. They must rather be the words which signify the things. This also makes sense given that in the next section of text from the 2nd chapter, Aristotle will go on to make a separate division of things that are. So it appears that Aristotle distinguishes between things that are and things that are said. For me, therefore, it makes most sense to assume that Aristotle is talking about words or spoken expressions. As Simplicius puts it, quote, "It is therefore more appropriate to say that what is said is significant expressions insofar as they are significant." End quote. In even further support of this account, Aristotle at the beginning of the De Interpretatione will discuss spoken sounds which are symbols of affections in the soul, and he goes on to speak of spoken sounds with combination, which is similar to what he is talking about here in the categories. It seems likely that the spoken sounds which are symbols from the De Interpretatione are the same as or similar to the things which are spoken from the categories. These are meaningful spoken sounds, meaningful utterances. St. Thomas Aquinas will call them significant vocal sounds. Simplicius, as we saw, called them significant expressions insofar as they are significant. Acrel, in his commentary, refers to the things that are said of the categories as simply expressions, and the Edkill translation, as we've seen, just calls them forms of speech. One other translation I looked at refers to words, expressions, and phrases. I think from all these we should get the general idea of what's being talked about. I'll probably go back and forth between using some of the above names, especially expressions and things that are said or spoken, which seems to be the most literal translation of the actual Greek word. So we're discussing expressions, and these, says the text, are divided into simple and composite. The Greek reads something like, "Of the things spoken, on the one hand are said those according to combination, on the other without combination." So what does the philosopher mean by with and without combination? The Greek word translated as combination or composition literally means interweaving or intertwining. As Acrel notes, quote, "The word is used by Plato in the Sophist, where he makes the point that a sentence is not just a list of names or a list of verbs, but results from the combination of a name with a verb." End quote. In that Platonic dialogue, the Sophist, the main speaker, called the Eleatic stranger, says, quote, "Discourse is never composed of nouns alone spoken in succession, nor of verbs spoken without nouns. For instance, walks, runs, sleeps, and the other verbs which denote actions, even if you utter all there are of them in succession, do not make discourse for all that. And again, when lion, stag, horse, and all other names of those who perform these actions are uttered, such a succession of words does not yet make discourse. For in neither case do the words uttered indicate action or inaction or existence of anything that exists or does not exist, until the verbs are mingled with the nouns. Then the words fit, and their first combination is a sentence, about the first and shortest form of discourse." End quote. In this last sentence, "then the words fit and their first combination is a sentence," the word that is translated as combination is the same root word as that in the 2nd chapter of the Categories, which Acrel also translates as combination. It's symploke in the Sophist and suplokein in the Categories. The point made by the stranger in the Sophist is again that a sentence cannot be formed by only a succession of nouns, or by only a succession of verbs, but must consist at the very least of a combination of a noun and a verb. So, for example, girl, apple, tree, road is not a sentence. It's just a random string of nouns. And also, walks, sleeps, sings, eats is not a sentence, but just a random string of verbs. But if we combine a noun and a verb to form something like the girl walks, then we have an actual sentence. The Stranger and the Sophist says that a sentence resulting from the combination of a noun with a verb is about the first and shortest form of discourse. And he goes on to say that one who speaks such a sentence, quote, makes a statement about that which is or is becoming or has become or is to be. He does not merely give names, but he reaches a conclusion by combining verbs with nouns. That is why we said that he discourses and does not merely give names, and therefore we gave to this combination the name of discourse. End quote. It seems pretty clear that Aristotle was aware of and influenced by the content of these passages. He will especially pick up themes from the Sophist again in the De Interpretatione, some of which we've already looked at. But the influence seems evident in the present text of the categories as well, and can help us shed light on what exactly it means. In the present text, Aristotle gives as examples of things said without combination, man, ox, runs, wins. And as examples of things said with combination, he gives man runs and man wins. The first list, similar to that in the Sophist, is just a string of random nouns and verbs which on their own do not form a sentence. But the second list is of nouns and verbs combined so as to form real sentences. If we just look at this division of things according to its Platonic influence, then it seems pretty straightforward. Things said without combination are simple expressions like nouns or verbs. Things said with combination are the conjoining of nouns and verbs to form sentences. But Acrel raises a difficulty with this account. He writes, quote, in the present passage, Aristotle's examples of expressions involving combination are both indicative sentences, and his examples of expressions without combination are all single words. Yet he ought not to intend only indicative sentences or only sentences to count as expressions involving combination. For in chapter 4, he says that every expression without combination signifies an item in some category. This implies that an expression like white man, which introduces two items from two categories, is an expression involving combination. End quote. What Acrel is getting at here is a question concerning expressions which don't seem to fall neatly into the basic division according to the interpretation we gave based on the Platonic backdrop. What do we do, for instance, with expressions consisting of a noun and an adjective, like green apple? On the one hand, such an expression, according to Acrel, signifies two distinct categories. In the 4th chapter of the categories, as we've already seen, Aristotle states that of things said without any combination, each signifies one of the categories. Thus it seems that an expression such as green apple would appear to be ruled out as something said without any combination. But on the other hand, this same expression lacks a verb and is not a complete sentence. Can it still count then as an expression said with combination? Thus the present difficulty. Is it the case, as would appear to be indicated by the examples given in the 2nd chapter, that things said with combination must be sentences involving at least the combination of a noun and verb after the manner of the criterion given in Plato's Sophist? Or is it the case that, since things said without combination must signify a single category, then things said with combination includes any expressions at all which signify multiple categories, regardless of whether they are sentences involving a noun and a verb? Let's consider a number of possible answers to this difficulty. The first thing to consider is whether the division between expressions said with combination and expressions said without combination is exhaustive. In other words, could there be some kind of expression which is neither of the above? To me, it seems very unlikely. I'm not aware of any place where Aristotle discusses some alternative to or middle way between things said with and without combination. Expressions said with combination and expressions said without combination seem to be contradictory statements. And for contradictory statements, as Aristotle says, it is necessary for one or the other to be true or false. So I think we should take it that these two options are indeed exhaustive, i.e., every expression must be said either with or without combination. Given this, we must decide whether an expression such as green apple counts as simple or complex, with or without combination. Let's go through a number of the different possible solutions to this difficulty. First, there is the possibility that in the text from chapter 2, Aristotle does not mean the examples he gives of things said with combination to be an exhaustive list of the kinds of expressions said with combination. After all, he only gives two explicit examples, man runs and man wins. Perhaps for Aristotle, indicative sentences such as these are the most complete kinds of expressions said with combination, and hence serve as appropriate paradigmatic models. On this account, an expression such as green apple does count as an expression said with combination, but one that is just not the most complete or paradigmatic kind of such expressions. This hypothesis might solve the immediate discrepancy, but to me it seems to not do full justice to either the Platonic backdrop we've explored or to what Aristotle says elsewhere. The sophist very strongly connects combination with the presence of both nouns and verbs together, and it would be a little strange if Aristotle were to use the same word with similar examples in such a similar context while altering its intended meaning from that of his teacher without stating so or explaining why. For this reason, it is my view that our prima facie assumption should lean towards holding that expressions said with combination require both a noun and a verb, but that still leaves us with our present difficulty unsolved. One other possibility is that an expression such as green apple does not count as an expression said with combination, but rather simply as a list of two distinct expressions said without combination, i.e. the simple expression green and the simple expression apple. Recall that the sophist says that a list of successive nouns or verbs alone does not constitute discourse, and hence would not constitute something said with combination. The simple expressions are said together, but they are still not said with combination. They retain their nature as non-composite expressions. So if, for Plato, a list of nouns such as lion, stag, horse does not count as an expression with combination, it might be somewhat plausible that an expression like green apple would just be considered a list of two successive simple expressions, one a noun and the other an adjective. Perhaps the relation between an expression like green apple and an expression said with combination is something like the relation between an artificial or accidental unity on the one hand and a full substantial or intrinsic unity on the other. To give a simplistic example, a single brick would be a simple expression, and a house made out of bricks would be like an expression said with combination. And then two bricks placed side by side would be like an expression such as green apple. The house is like something whole and complete, a full thing in its own right. But the two bricks placed next to each other have only a kind of accidental or artificial unity. They do not yet together make up something whole and complete, but still only something partial. The bricks, as part of the house, make up a new thing, while the two bricks side by side don't make up any other thing. They are still simply two individual bricks which happen to be lying next to each other. What's problematic here is that unlike the list lion, stag, horse, which consists of just arbitrary, unconnected nouns, the expression green apple does have some real connection and unity. Green is not totally separate from apple, as it is meant to really describe and accompany it. Hence, the two terms share a genuine connection. This is an important consideration, but it might not be completely fatal to the present account. Perhaps it is possible that the two simple expressions can share some real connection without thereby rising to the full level of an expression said with combination. Perhaps combination is a technical name which only applies to expressions which combine a noun and a verb, as the sophist would indicate. In this case, even if two expressions are connected in some way, as long as they aren't connected with a verb, they still fall short of being said with combination. This brings us to yet another possibility. Perhaps an expression such as green apple is neither an expression said with combination nor two distinct expressions said without combination. Perhaps, despite consisting of two different words, such an expression functions as a simple expression, an expression said without combination. After all, the term green in this expression, as an adjective, serves a somewhat derivative or secondary role, functioning as an accompanying description of the noun apple, as we mentioned above. Perhaps the expression green apple is made up of two terms which together signify one thing, an actual individual apple. In this case, the term green is not serving to name the color green in itself, but to apply the color green to the apple. In other words, the term green on its own might signify the color green by itself, considered in the abstract, and as such it would signify a color which falls under the category of quality. But in an expression like green apple, the term green is not on its own, but is modifying another term, and so serves to signify not the color green itself in the abstract, but actually the apple which it describes. But this account seems somewhat unsatisfactory as it now stands. In fact, the term green does not signify the apple itself, at least qua apple, but signifies specifically the color of the apple, and color, as we've said, falls under a distinct category from substance. So even if the term green is functioning to modify the term apple, it still seems to signify something in a category other than substance. And so, at least at this point, it is difficult to conceive how an expression like green apple could function as an expression said without combination, if, as Aristotle indicates, such an expression must signify a single category. One point, however, which still might be presented in support of the above account is the fact that in both the passage from the sophist and the present passage in the categories, it is plausible that that which is under consideration is not all speech as such, but specifically speech involving categorical predication. As explained in the previous episode, predication in general is the attribution of something to a subject, such as in the sentence, "The tree is tall." Here I am predicating tallness of a subject, the tree. The example just given is an example of a categorical proposition. In such a proposition, the subject and predicate, even if they each consist of multiple words, both function as a single term, i.e. a single subject or single predicate. So in the proposition, green apples are fruits, the expression green apples functions as a single subject, since it is as a single whole that it receives the attribution of the predicate. And as a single subject, although the term green still refers to the color of the apple, the expression as a whole refers to a type of substance, namely green apples. So, qua subject, it is possible that the expression could be considered as an expression without combination. Similarly, the expression rational animal signifies the substance human, and so that expression, although consisting of two distinct terms, still seems to pick out a single category. Rational animal is an expression which, as it were, stands for the single term human, and hence would appear as a whole to signify the single category substance. Aristotle himself indicates something like this in the Topics, where he says, quote, "A definition is a phrase signifying a thing's essence. It is rendered in the form either of a phrase in lieu of a name or a phrase in lieu of another phrase." End quote. The above interpretation seems to have at least some support in the Aristotelian and scholastic traditions. It is in some ways akin, for example, to the view given by Edward D. Simmons in his book The Scientific Art of Logic, which follows these traditions. Simmons makes a twofold division of the simple and complex. The first division is according to the classical distinction between the first two operations of the intellect, which are simple apprehension on the one hand and judgment on the other. Simple apprehension has as its object an individual nature or essence or quiddity. For instance, when I simply grasp or understand concepts such as apple or house, I am exercising this operation of the intellect. But when I make a judgment about an object, I am exercising the second operation. This is the operation which attaches a copula or verb to a concept. Simmons writes, quote, "In simple apprehension we merely grasp a nature or quiddity. In judgment we know not only quiddity, but the act of existing, for we make an affirmation or denial about the way a nature is." End quote. So according to this division of simple and complex, an expression is not complex until it contains both noun and verb, both subject and copula. This is the division which we find in Plato and which I have suggested makes the most sense for the text of the categories. But then Simmons adds a second division, according to which the simple expressions of the first division are themselves further divided into complex and incomplex again. So he says that, quote, "In another sense, one object of simple apprehension may differ from another as the incomplex from the complex." End quote. Here he says that, for example, man is an incomplex object of simple apprehension, while healthy man is a complex object of simple apprehension. Because while man involves just the single concept of human nature, healthy man involves both the concept of human nature and the concept of health. So on Simmons's view, to go back to our own example, the expression apple, or the expression apple is an incomplex expression said without combination, while the expression green apple is a complex expression said without combination. Note that both are still said without combination since neither contains a verb. As such, in order to solve the difficulty of how an expression with two terms can still signify only a single category, as Chapter 4 of the Categories requires, Simmons's account needs to be combined with something like the view I gave before, that an expression like green apple can function as a single subject of a categorical proposition. It must be noted that Simmons's view is certainly not explicitly contained in the text of the Categories, but for myself I find it appealing. By making a double division, this account is able to maintain the Platonic backdrop and the apparent meaning of Aristotle's text, while also making sense of questions such as the one raised by Ackrell. One final possibility I'd like to mention is that a phrase such as green apple actually means something like the expression the apple that is green, in which case it would appear to mean the equivalent of something said with combination. The difficulty here is that Aristotle is referring, as we have discussed, to things which are spoken, i.e. spoken expressions, and the spoken expression green apple is not said with combination, even if it means something with combination. So we've now discussed a number of possible answers to Ackrell's difficulty. I will repeat here what I've said earlier. It is my view that however one solves the difficulty, one's solution must hold that any expression involving combination must at the very least contain both a noun and a verb together. Earlier I defended this position on the basis of the Platonic backdrop, but now I'm going to give additional support from what Aristotle says elsewhere, specifically in the De Interpretatione. As we have already seen, at the beginning of this work, Aristotle states that spoken sounds are symbols of affections in the soul, and written marks are symbols of spoken sounds. He then says, giving the Edkill translation, quote, "As there are in the mind thoughts which do not involve truth or falsity, and also those which must be either true or false, so it is in speech. For truth and falsity imply combination and separation. Nouns and verbs, provided nothing is added, are like thoughts without combination or separation. Man and white, as isolated terms, are not yet either true or false. In proof of this, consider the word goat stag. It has significance, but there is no truth or falsity about it, unless is or is not is added, either in the present or in some other tense." End quote. Here Aristotle relates combination to truth and falsity. He says that single terms like tree or river are in themselves neither true nor false. For instance, if I just say to you the word house, I have not made a statement that could possibly be correct or incorrect. I've just said a single word. It is only when I make a statement such as, "the house is large," that what I've said can be assessed as right or wrong. Even if I state a word such as unicorn, which signifies a non-existent object, I have not said something false unless I use a verb to assert something about the unicorn, such as that it exists or that it lacks a horn. Aristotle goes on to say that every proposition or statement has truth or falsity, and that every proposition must contain a verb. He says that, quote, "A simple proposition is a statement with meaning as to the presence of something in a subject or its absence," end quote. And that the, quote, "first class of simple propositions is the simple affirmation," end quote. And that, quote, "an affirmation is a positive assertion of something about something," end quote. In these statements, we have explicit affirmation that something said with combination must contain at least a noun and a verb. Anything without both noun and verb together cannot contain truth or falsity, and hence does not rise to the level of being said with combination. As he will also state in the 4th chapter of the Categories, after listing the 10 categories and giving examples of each, quote, "No one of these, in and by itself, involves an affirmation. It is by the combination of such terms that positive or negative statements arise. For every assertion must, as is admitted, be either true or false, whereas expressions which are not in any way composite, such as man, white, runs, wins, cannot be either true or false," end quote. From these texts, I think it can safely be said that Ackrell is incorrect when he suggests that, quote, "Aristotle ought not to intend only indicative sentences or only sentences to count as expressions involving combination," end quote. But there is even more that we can say. In the De Interpretatione, Aristotle says that even the definition of man is not yet a proposition, and that, quote, "to explain why two-footed land animal is one thing and not many belongs to a different inquiry. Certainly it will not be one simply through being said altogether," end quote. Here Aristotle explicitly says that at least the definition of something like man, which consists of many words, is one thing and not many. Of course, we might wonder if being one thing is the same as being without combination, but at the very least, he does clearly say that the definition is not yet a proposition until a verb is added, which indicates that a definition does indeed count as an expression without combination, despite consisting of multiple words. Now, this does not entirely solve our problem, since Aristotle also says that the definition is not one simply because the words happen to be said together. In other words, the definition is one because the different words of the expression have some kind of intrinsic unity or connection, and it is an open question whether another expression, like our green apple, shares the same kind of intrinsic unity as definition does. But Aristotle has more to say elsewhere. Later on in the De Interpretatione, he writes, quote, "There is no unity about an affirmation or denial which, either positively or negatively, predicates one thing of many subjects, or many things of the same subject, unless that which is indicated by the many is really some one thing. I do not apply this word one to those things which, though they have a single recognized name, yet do not combine to form a unity. Thus man may be an animal and biped and domesticated, but these three predicates combine to form a unity. On the other hand, the predicates white, man, and walking do not thus combine. Neither, therefore, if these three form the subject of an affirmation, nor if they form its predicate, is there any unity about that affirmation." End quote. Here Aristotle appears to further explicate his distinction between a purely nominal or linguistic unity and a real or intrinsic unity. He also seems to go beyond merely logical to more metaphysical considerations. But what is important for us now is the fact that he clearly seems to think that an expression with multiple words can serve as a single subject or single predicate. This is significant because in the prior analytics, he defines a term as, quote, "that into which the proposition is resolved, i.e. both the predicate and that of which it is predicated, is or is not being added," end quote. So it would seem that if an expression with multiple words can serve as a subject or a predicate into which a proposition is resolved, as at least a definition can, then such an expression can count as a single term. There is much more that could be said, but I think what we've said already is sufficient for now. Before we finish, I'd like to give some options for contacting me if you have any comments or suggestions. First, you can, or questions. First, you can contact me via social media. I run a Disputed Questions Facebook page as well as Twitter and Instagram accounts. Just search Disputed Questions and you should find them. You can also follow my personal Twitter account at HHJennings. That's JENNINGS. Second, you can contact me through my blog, which can be found at disputedquestionsblog.com. Just go to the contact page and fill out the form. Finally, you can send me an email directly at disputedquestionsblog@gmail.com. If you enjoy the podcast, there are a number of ways you can help it out. First, you can just subscribe and download the podcast from wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel where we post each episode. Finally, it would be a lot of help if you could leave a rating and review for us on iTunes. As for future episodes, I am going to try at this point to release about one a month. I'd like it to be more frequent than that, but realistically, one a month is a good goal for where I am right now. So stay tuned for episode 4, and until then, thanks for listening.